New York Times recently published a puff piece expose about a white supremacist named Tony Havater that has caused some outrage. Articles that try their hardest to portray white supremacists as, quote, not so bad, normal people who are just like you, have become very common in the age of Trump. I think there's a way to psychoanalyze white supremacists in written form, but the rejection of white supremacy and nationalist extremism has to be hammered home in the article itself. When you do what this New York Times writer did and simply write about a Nazi fascist without being critical, then don't be surprised when people question your agenda and accuse you of normalizing dangerous people. I'm not going to break down the article in its entirety because it's honestly not worth the time. There are just a few key parts that I want to mention. So, the article starts out by talking about how Havater and his wife just got married and they were worried about Antifa showing up to the ceremony. Then the article goes on to say, quote, Mr. Havater, and I might be mispronouncing his name, but just roll with it. Mr. Havater, 29, is a welder by trade, okay? He is not a star among the resurgent radical American right so much as a committed foot soldier, an organizer, an occasional podcast guest on a website called Radio Aryan, and a self-described social media villain, although in person, his Midwestern manners would please anyone's mother. In 2015, he helped start the Traditionalist Worker Party, one of the extreme right-wing groups that marched in Charlottesville, Virginia in August, and again at a White Lives Matter rally last month in Tennessee. The group's stated mission is to, quote, fight for the interests of white Americans, end quote. So, the author of this article here, instead of exposing some of the things that are allowed on a podcast named Radio Aryan, instead he wrote about this Nazi's manners. His manners, an appeal to a woman's mother. As you can see, there's nothing critical here. So this is more of an advertisement than anything else. Articles like this are very dangerous because they give dangerous people a platform and leave the reader to decide whether or not this is something that should be supported. When you write about Nazis and other forms of white supremacy without making it clear that these are bad people with bad ideas that have literally gotten tens of thousands, if not millions of people murdered in the not too distant past, you essentially leave the door cracked open for people to say, well, that doesn't sound too bad. He's just fighting for the interest of white Americans. Without actually diving deeper into explaining how the interests of white Americans usually means destroying the rights, lives, and families of non-whites, then you're really dropping the ball, journalistically speaking, without actually doing that, without breaking that down. This is a very reckless article. But despite being reckless as all hell, there are trends one can see in this article that have been mentioned in other articles about the same topic. You see the common trend of how white supremacists are refining their tactics to appeal more to white people who aren't extremists and don't think of themselves as racist. Even in this article, okay, it's mentioned several times how Havater used to be a so-called leftist, alright, and how his wife used to be liberal. I'm going to touch on that later on in the video. Havater also believes, laughably so, that he could be a self-admitted white nationalist and not be racist. This is how deep the pathology of racism, denialism, is for many people in this country. It's very deep. Denying racism is a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people, so much so that people who are open and blatantly racist claim they aren't racist while they promote Adolf Hitler and apologize for the Holocaust. That denialism is a hell of a drug. There's also a consistent trait you see from white supremacists, and that's their disdain for democracy. Okay, this is very important. One of the things that anti-fascists and anti-racists hammer home more than most other groups is this assumption that a lot of people in America have that I don't really think is founded on anything. It's this assumption that all Americans support democracy and are on the same page about democracy. And that's completely false. When you talk about freedom and liberty, or when they talk about freedom and liberty, they're talking about it for themselves. Okay, they're not talking about it for all people. They're not speaking universally. I think liberals miss this point a lot because so many liberals only want to see the good in people, and there's this naive notion that people can have very bad, destructive ideas but still be good people. There are a lot of people in America who don't believe in universal equality, okay, and universal justice. And you have jingoists out here who have a difficult time acknowledging this reality because it conflicts with their absolutism on topics like free speech. We know free speech laws protect white supremacists, and there's nothing we can do about that. But should people on the left be actively attacking other leftists because some of us go to protest to shut these dangerous people down? Should anti-fascist and anti-racist outrage be micromanaged to be more acceptable to the feelings of others? You see, I don't care about any of that. Everyone on the left isn't on the same page with regards to how to handle the rise of far-right extremism in America, and there are some real fault lines that are forming. Some take the approach that they should be defeated in the realm of ideas and that their rallies should just be ignored. Okay, and I'm not totally bashing that concept because we do beat them on the ideas front. We have better ideas than they do, and their ideas are backed by like an ideology that was debunked decades ago. So it's a factually debunked ideology that white supremacists have, so it wouldn't be hard to defeat them purely just on ideas. And sometimes you might want to ignore them. You don't always want to clash every single time they come around, but others see white supremacists for who they are and the very real danger they represent. Some of us see that they don't care about winning on the ideas. See, that's the thing. They don't care about that. They've never cared about that because they know that's where the left is strong. The left wins when it's strictly about policy. Okay, for them, it's about winning at all costs. If that means destroying American democracy in the process, then so be it. They don't care about ideas that aren't their own. They don't care about having the facts wrong or supporting debunked notions of superiority. White supremacy, by its very nature, is anti-fact, anti-science, and anti-democratic. As a matter of fact, they see progressive populist ideas as their biggest threat because those ideas are popular. Before I continue this rant, I want to add a couple more quotes from the article. There was a part of the article that even went so far as to act as low-key promotion for a neo-Nazi armband that appears somewhere on Tony Havertz's website. It mentions this armband twice, and on one paragraph, even going so far as to say it's $20, even mentioning how it's meant to appeal to fans of fantasy and role-playing. Listen to this quote. Listen. It says, quote, "Its leaders claim to oppose racism, though the Anti-Defamation League says the group has, quote, participated in white supremacist events all over the country," end quote. On its website, a swastika armband goes for $20. That last sentence is completely random and sticks out like a sore thumb. Why is it important to describe an armband that can be bought on his website? Why? To prove he's racist? That's honestly implied by the very nature of the article. It's not like somebody is going to be reading this and not believe Havertz is a white supremacist until they get to the part about him selling a Nazi armband for $20. And they're going to be like, oh, so he is racist because he's selling a Nazi armband. No. Like, the minute you hear that this guy has a podcast called Radio Aryan, that should be self-explanatory. You have to be pretty thick in the head to not connect the dots there until you get to the Nazi armband part. That comes off as a low-key promotion. Then later, about the same damn armband. It says, quote, on the party's website, the swastika armband is formally listed as a NSDAP LARP armband. That's a mouthful. NSDAP was the abbreviation for Hitler's Nazi Party. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. LARP stands for Live Action Role Playing, a term originally meant to describe fantasy fans who dress up as wizards and warlocks. But the movement is no joke. The party, Mr. Havoxer said, is now approaching 1,000 people. Yeah, it's no joke. This movement is no joke. It's real. It should be taken seriously. Again, what does any of this have to do with anything? Why did this author feel the need to write this article? What's the point he's trying to get across other than the idea that white supremacists like normal things, like normal people? Normal people who don't idealize genocidal mass murderers like Hitler. The point of the article is to portray white supremacists in a less antagonistic light. There's no other way to describe it. There are a litany of questions and inquiries that the author could have pushed that would have exposed Havertz for who he really is. Challenge his Holocaust denial with irrefutable facts about what happened. Okay, there are a lot of things that could have been done. At one point when the article was first posted, they had an actual link to the Nazi armband on Havertz's website. They gave this guy backlinks. They gave this guy's website a backlink, a very juicy backlink from the New York Times. Not only did they link to the guy's site, which would have sent it tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of clicks over time had it not been for the backlash, but he certainly would have profited off of it as well. A lot of people who have written about this controversy haven't pointed that out. That's a really sketchy move by the New York Times. Now, because of the backlash, they took the link down because people called them out. But the link never should have been up there in the first place. So the New York Times has tried to explain away the decision to publish the article by saying they're just shining a light on the dark corners of America. Okay, whatever. The national editor of the New York Times wrote a whole explainer piece the day after the article dropped, and tell me if any of this makes any sense. In the article, he said, quote, "The point of the story was not to normalize anything, but to describe the degree to which hate and extremism have become far more normal in American life than many of us want to think," end quote. This is what you call a contradictory statement, ladies and gentlemen. He said they weren't trying to normalize anything, then went on to say they wanted to describe the degree to which hate and extremism have become far more normal. So therefore, you're normalizing it. If something isn't normal already, and you want to describe how it's becoming normal, and you do that by writing positively of the person who isn't normal, by saying he's just like you, then that's normalization. This guy just contradicted the hell out of himself. That's not how folks should be writing about this. I'm not saying it's wrong to write about the rise of fascism and white supremacy in America. I think that needs to be discussed. But analysis devoid of criticism is suspect. It's just suspect and problematic. It's the difference between writing a critical narrative and a fluff piece. Then the editor quoted Shane Bauer of Mother Jones, who tweeted in defense of the article stating, quote, "People mad about this article want to believe that Nazis are monsters we cannot relate to. White supremacists are normal ass white people, and it's been that way in America since 1776. We will continue to be in trouble till we understand that," end quote. This tweet is all kinds of problematic. First of all, Nazis are monsters who I, and the vast majority of people of color, especially black people, cannot relate to. Just because I may like the same damn pizza toppings and video games of a white supremacist doesn't mean we have the same damn common bond, or we have any common bond. Are we now supposed to be looking for things to relate with Nazis on? I think not. Then he says white supremacists are normal ass white people, and it's been that way since 1776. No, white supremacists actually are not that normal. And I'm going to explain why in a second. I think people get confused with this word normal. I don't want to get into a semantics argument, but when something is normal, it just means that it has a consistency to it. A trend, if you will. Something that is normal is a pattern of practice that is expected to have certain qualities and traits. So to say that white supremacists are normal ass white people is to say that the standard of white America is white supremacy. Or phrased differently, that white supremacy is the default setting of white people from birth. And I don't believe that. People want so bad to say that white supremacy is normal because the only other alternative is to say that it's abnormal. And people don't want to do that. Fact of the matter is, white people are not born racist. They are born into a system just like us that they decide at some point in time in their lives whether or not to support it. That system is white supremacy, and white supremacy is not normal. It's no more normal than the Holocaust was normal, or the Spanish Inquisition, where people were burnt at the stake for being accused of being witches and whatnot, like the Salem witch trials. White supremacy is a population control tool that was invented to artificially place white people over all other groups. Saying that white supremacy is normal is to say that the ranking of white on top of black is also normal. And when most people hear the word normal, their knee-jerk reaction is to think that it's not as threatening or not as big of a deal as they should be thinking of it. People tend to play things down when they think it's the norm. Okay, so the normalization of slavery. Okay, let's start giving examples. The normalization of slavery is what kept slaves on the plantation. If you really want to get deep, okay, you can say that it's when the Haitians realized how abnormal their condition was that they began plotting against their oppressors. You think the Haitian Revolution happens if the Haitians think slavery is their normal lot in life and that they should just somehow accept it because, well, that's the way it is? No. The normalization of slavery would have kept them in chains. It's only when they realized how abnormal the barbaric treatment of the French was that they realized they had to act. And the same thing applies to slavery all over the place in all forms. There's even a quote from Harriet Tubman that has floated around for some years where she said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they only knew they were slaves." Okay, so that goes to show you the normalization of slavery for a lot of slaves. You had a lot of slaves after slavery ended. They went to their former masters looking for work. Like, the normalization of slavery, what we're really talking about is we're talking about Stockholm Syndrome. Okay, Stockholm Syndrome is when people who are victimized by something or who are systematically oppressed by something for long enough or over a long enough period, they begin to adopt the same ideology or they just begin to accept what's happening to them as normal. Okay, so normalization is what happens when you don't act, and or conversely, if you're not acting and you should be acting on something, it probably means to an extent the thing that you should be acting against, the thing you should be fighting against, you've normalized it. You've internally normalized it to some extent. The same thing can be said about any movement. Movements happen when society realizes that there are abnormalities that threaten them that need to be addressed. So saying that white supremacy is normal actually reinforces it. It doesn't expose it at all. You see, I need people to think deep like this. This is why words are very important. I think part of the prevention of the normalization of white supremacy has to involve denormalizing racism itself. It's by realizing that what happens to black people in America really isn't normal. You think it's normal for America to have the world's largest prison population with a fraction of the world's total population? You think it's normal to want to see the downfall of democracy just to make sure people of color who have been oppressed don't compete with you on an equal playing field? We cannot allow these types of ideas to be considered normal concepts. Okay? There's nothing normal about lynching, for instance. Lynching was an act of barbarism. I was about to say is an act of barbarism because there are some very strange stories of hangings that have come up recently. But historically, if we look to the past and confirmed lynching cases, there's nothing normal about that shit. They were white supremacists as hell, but that's not normal. Lynching was never normal. Okay? So, articles like this only reinforce the need for independent black media. Media that will be unapologetic in its interpretation of current events. A media that will be thought-provoking and free enough to think for itself, not carrying the water for a party, but for the truth. Where is the profile of families of the victims of state violence? Ask me, I want to know that. That's the side of America that people don't know about too. Where's the profile of people who have been hurt by neo-Nazis and have been victims of far-right extremism? I haven't seen nearly as many exposés about Black Lives Matter or Antifa as I have seen about neo-Nazis and white supremacists over the past year. Richard Spencer, for instance, has been given platforms that give him access to millions of people. Where's the balance? You see, this is what happens when white supremacy becomes normalized. And that's all. The normalization of white supremacy is already taking place. Racists and Nazis have to be understood, but anti-racists and anti-fascists get called Russian collaborators and are silenced. Pay very close attention to what's happening in parts of Europe, for instance, regarding white supremacy and neo-Nazism. The normalization of white supremacy in the European Union has opened the door, allowing white supremacists to win seats in legislative and executive offices all over the region. Not that it's been any different here in America, but the racists in America in the past hid their racism after the civil rights movement. They codified it to be more subtle and clandestine. But the people vying for power now are way more extreme than their predecessors. Many people have been warning about the rise of fascism for many years in America, and when it comes, it'll come in the form of far-right extremists like Haviter, who members of the corporate media and corporate press will not be critical of, and who they will allow to spew their hatred unchallenged in the name of free speech absolutism. And don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that America will have its own version of that Nazi fascist rally that happened in Poland from a few weeks ago. Matter of fact, we've already had something similar, if not worse. It's called Charlottesville, and it happened this past summer. We are much further down the rabbit hole than people realize. I think if folks start applying the logic in this video, speaking out and taking a stand will be much easier if you begin to realize, if you begin to see that white supremacy is, like I said, a social abnormality. It's easier when you realize that the society you live in just doesn't function right and is full of consistently abnormal inconsistencies that don't benefit you or your people. The longer you think white supremacy is normal, the more you will make excuses to not do a damn thing about it.